Europe can ensure that his rights are adequately safeguarded abroad. Thirdly, ACTA must and will remain in line with the acquis communautaire, including the current level of harmonisation of IPR enforcement, the e-commerce directive, the regulatory telecom framework and, last but not least, the applicable EU legislation on data protection and privacy. There will be no harmonisation or changes to EU legislation through the back door. In this sense, ACTA will have no impact on European citizens, since it will not create new obligations for the EU and no need for implementing legislation. However, it will provide our innovators increased protection in overseas markets. I am aware of the concerns expressed by some of you about the introduction of a compulsory 3 strikes rule, or a graduated response, to fight copyright infringements and internet piracy. Let me be very clear on this, so there is no room for ambiguity. The 3 strike rule or graduated response systems are not compulsory in Europe. Different EU countries have different approaches, and we want to keep this flexibility while fully respecting fundamental rights, freedoms and civil liberties. The EU does not support and will not accept that ACTA creates an obligation to disconnect people from the internet because of illegal downloads. Similarly, we shall make sure that ACTA does not hamper access to generic medicines. I know there has been some controversy on the impact of EU customs legislation on trade in generic medicines. As I already told you at my hearing, this problem will be addressed in the upcoming revision of our customs legislation. Finally, you also have asked about an impact assessment of ACTA. In fact, considering that the Commission will not go beyond the EU acquis, we based ourselves on the studies made for the 2004 directive on the enforcement of intellectual property rights and for the 2005 proposal for a directive on criminal enforcement of IPR, which is, by the way, not adopted. We also considered the conclusions of the OECD study on the economic impact of counterfeiting and piracy of 2008. This study values the economy of physical internationally traded counterfeits at $250 billion, that is to say higher than the individual GDP of 150 countries. It also contains an exhaustive analysis dedicated to the piracy of digital content. In short, I hear your concerns and I will defend them to the best of my ability. Your confidence and support will help me carry this important task forward. Thank you, President.
Thank you, Commissioner de Gucht. I'll hand the floor now to the groups. To begin with, Ms. Tokia Saifi, 2 minutes. Thank you, President. Commissioner, since the Lisbon Treaty came into effect, we have new powers that we want to see respected right from the outset. We have requested that a consultation process be put into place on a constant basis with continuous supervision. The European citizens are represented through the European Parliament, and the European Parliament members need to be regularly informed of the content of negotiations, while respecting the confidentiality clauses, as you've mentioned, that are indicated in the agreement. Today, we want to be fully connected with the legislative process. We want to be informed of the text and the outcomes of the negotiations. Our group would also like to continue negotiations to get a plurilateral treaty to improve standards of information, as well as to improve the situation with intellectual property rights, particularly ones that the emerging economies such as China can subscribe to. We want to combat counterfeiting and underground activities which represent a danger for the agreement, but also for society, as well as for the spirit of enterprise. For many years, business have invested in research and innovation, and they're now seeing the fruits of that investment. And so this is where the heart of the competitiveness of the European Union lies. I think as we develop our digital world, we cannot say that counterfeiting has become immaterial. We need to continue to make internet actors responsible, particularly those who try to overturn intellectual property rights and who go against fundamental rights and civil liberties. Let us work together to find that balance between duties and responsibilities. Thank you.
Köszönöm, Saïfi asszony.
Thank you, Ms. Saifi. 2 minutes now for Mr. David Martin.
Thank you, President. Thank you, Commissioner, for your contribution. You said at the end of your contribution that you've heard our concerns and you're responding to them. Well, I think, as they say, up to a point. I'm not convinced you've entirely grasped all our concerns about the ACTA negotiations. It's true that there is common ground between us in terms of the fact that IPR right holders deserve a fair return on their rights, that counterfeit goods can and do sometimes pose a threat to human health. And so, like you, we are not against international cooperation to tackle piracy, to tackle counterfeiting and to deal with other abuses of intellectual property right. But we repeat, it has to be based on the existing acquis communautaire, and I thought you were, if you're saying an absolute assurance on that, then I'll accept it, but you said you were not going to do it through the back door, which seemed to me that still gave you the opportunity to do it through the front door. But if you're saying absolutely no move to the acquis communautaire, then I'm pleased to hear that, and I accept your word on that. Similarly, you said you would not criminalise individuals for downloading from the internet, but then you talked about the external borders of the community and what might happen with people going away rather than coming into the EU. So again, we don't want anything in ACTA that criminalises anyone for individual use. Even though we might frown on it, nobody should be criminalised for personal use of copyright material. And of course, any action through ACTA has to be proportional to the aims. It's not a blank cheque for copyright holders. And the problem, as every other member has said, we don't know the situation because of the secrecy surrounding this. Now, I welcome the fact that you've given a strong commitment to get the draft negotiating text and that you'll put pressure on the other parties. I think you have to tell the other parties, though, that this will not strengthen you as a negotiator, it will weaken you as a negotiator if you cannot release the draft text, because you will not have, I hope it's very clear tonight, you will not have the support of this House if we cannot see the draft text on which you are working. Finally, on a positive note, I welcome your comments on generic medicine and I look forward to seeing the review of the customs regulation. Thank you.
Köszönöm szépen, Martin úr.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Next, Ms. Intveld, 2.5 minutes.
Colleagues, Commissioner, when preparing for this debate about copyright, intellectual property rights and how we want to protect the creative and intellectual efforts of our fellow citizens, I had to think back to the theft a couple of years ago of a truck with the new Harry Potter books just days before its release. But today the thief wouldn't bother with stealing a truck. He would simply illegally download it onto his laptop or MP3 player and carry it across the border. Commissioner, I welcome your commitment to transparency, but according to the briefing note kindly provided